The lobby of Whitaker Global Logistics pulsed with its usual Monday rhythm. Phones buzzed. Heels clicked across polished marble. Screens blinked under fluorescent lights as executives rushed through glass doors, their voices blending into a low hum of deadlines, client calls, and clipped conversations about quarterly targets. The company sat on top of an intricate global web, with offices stretching from Tokyo to Sao Paulo, each string tighter than the next. And lately, those strings had begun to fray. CEO Alexander Whitaker had come down from the executive floor earlier than usual. He was not here for appearances. Recent murmurs about internal culture slipping beneath the weight of rapid expansion had reached his ears. The pressure was building, not only from investors demanding bolder growth, but from international clients frustrated by small but costly missteps in communication. A single mistranslation last month had nearly derailed a major contract with a German shipping partner. Whitaker had built this empire on precision, and now that precision was cracking in places unseen from his high-floor office. As he crossed the lobby, scanning the faces of employees who barely noticed his presence, a voice pulled him out of his thoughts. Smooth. Crisp. Mandarin. Not the hesitant, academic Mandarin that most Westerners butcher, but fluid, native-level cadence that rolled like water over polished stones. Whitaker stopped mid-stride. His eyes swept the lobby, expecting perhaps one of the international sales representatives had arrived early. But instead, standing beside the touchscreen directory, was a woman in a burgundy janitor's uniform. Slim build. Silver hair pulled neatly into a twist. Calmly, she was speaking to an older man in a dark suit who looked both confused and relieved as she pointed him gently toward the elevators. The CEO narrowed his eyes, his mind racing to place her. He had passed her before during late nights, after investor meetings and budget reviews. Always quiet. Always polite. Never drawing attention. May, he thought, vaguely recalling the name from a cleaning roster he barely glanced at. But this was not just a polite janitor offering directions. This was something else. As the man thanked her in Mandarin and stepped away, another voice entered the mix. A delivery worker approached, struggling with a clipboard and half-muttered Spanish. Without missing a beat, the woman turned and answered him, switching into flawless Spanish with the ease of flipping a light switch. The man smiled, nodded, and continued toward the freight elevator. Whitaker's pulse quickened. Still, she wasn't done. Just as a vendor appeared, dragging a mislabeled shipment of office equipment, she pivoted effortlessly into French, her tone warm but direct, pointing him toward the appropriate conference suite without hesitation. Now Alexander stood frozen. Not from anger. Not from suspicion. But from the strange, unsettling weight of realization. For years, he had built teams, hired specialists, invested millions into global communication platforms and cultural training programs. And yet, here, in his own building, pushing a cart and wiping down surfaces each night, was someone effortlessly bridging linguistic gaps that cost his company time and money every single week. Around him, the lobby carried on. The front desk answered phones. Analysts hustled toward morning meetings. Interns sipped coffee, glued to Slack messages. Nobody else noticed what had just unfolded. Nobody looked twice at the janitor. Not until now. Whitaker felt the first pinch of something unfamiliar. Guilt. How long had she worked here? How many nights had he walked past Brilliance disguised beneath polyester and utility gloves? He exhaled slowly, his eyes locked on her as she resumed stacking supplies neatly onto her cleaning cart, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But something extraordinary had happened. And Alexander Whitaker was not a man who ignored what others missed. Not anymore. Alexander Whitaker sat quietly, his eyes studying the woman across from him. There was nothing flashy about her. No resume in hand. No carefully curated LinkedIn profile or executive poise. Just Maye Musk, sitting there in her burgundy uniform, calm, collected, unbothered by the office's towering windows or the heavy air of power that filled the executive suite. "You said you speak 9 languages," he began, his voice steady but tinged with genuine curiosity. "Yes, sir," she answered softly. "Can you list them for me?" "Of course. Mandarin, Spanish, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, Arabic, Russian, and Afrikaans." He let out a quiet breath. Afrikaans. That caught his attention. You're South African? Born and raised, she nodded. My parents were immigrants. They pushed education very hard, always believed that knowledge was the only real security we could have. He leaned forward slightly. And yet, you work here. Cleaning. I do, sir. Forgive me, May, but with skills like yours, you could be anywhere. Doing anything. Her lips curved into a faint smile. Life rarely moves in straight lines, Mr. Whitaker. Mine certainly didn't. Tell me. She exhaled, folding her hands neatly in her lap as though she'd rehearsed this in the quiet of her own mind many times before but never had the chance to share it aloud. I studied dietetics and nutrition at the University of Pretoria. Earned my master's degree. I was actually preparing to teach at the university level. You were going to be a professor. That was the plan, she said simply. But plans, they shift. I married young. Had 3 children. My marriage ended. Suddenly, it was just me and the kids. And the bills. Alexander sat back slightly. The weight of her words settled in his chest like a slow, heavy stone. I moved to Canada for a fresh start, she continued. But as you might imagine, raising 3 children alone while building a career wasn't simple. I worked wherever I could find hours. Lectured part-time when someone would hire me. Modeled occasionally when the opportunity came. I even did speaking engagements on nutrition and wellness when invited. You modeled? She smiled, almost amused. Yes. But that was another lifetime. He sensed there was more beneath that sentence, layers of history carefully tucked away, perhaps out of humility or perhaps out of exhaustion from explaining it too many times before. The hours were never predictable, she went on. And raising children required stability more than ambition. When I found custodial work, it allowed me to pick up my kids from school, help with homework, and be home at night. That mattered more than titles or degrees. And the languages? She breathed in gently, as though that question brought a different kind of comfort. I never wanted my mind to go stagnant. Languages gave me structure. Every new word was like a puzzle piece fitting into place. I borrowed textbooks, listened to recordings, read newspapers from different countries, practiced with anyone who would tolerate my mistakes. You did all that on your own? I had no choice. It kept me sharp. Gave me something that was just mine, even when everything else was unstable. Alexander nodded slowly, absorbing each detail. This was not some casual hobbyist. This was a woman who had built a quiet fortress of knowledge and discipline around herself while the world kept moving past her. And yet, he had walked by her countless times. Never once looking beyond the uniform. Never once wondering who sat behind the name tag. He felt the quiet sting of guilt again. How many others like her filled his company, unseen, unasked, undervalued? Do you enjoy working here? He asked gently. She considered the question, eyes lowering for a moment. I enjoy having work. I enjoy providing. But I won't pretend that cleaning offices was my dream. He smiled faintly at her honesty. May looked up, her voice steady but softer now. But I'm grateful. My children are grown. They're successful, independent. One is a filmmaker, another runs restaurants, and my oldest, well, he's done quite well in technology. Alexander raised his eyebrows slightly at that final note but chose not to press. He sensed she wasn't offering the full picture, and that was her choice to make. You've sacrificed a great deal, he said softly. She smiled again, but this time there was a flicker of something deeper behind her eyes. It's called being a parent. He couldn't help but admire her. Not just for the languages or the education or even her resilience, but for the way she carried herself through it all, without bitterness or entitlement. Just quiet, persistent strength. May, he said carefully, I don't believe people like you should remain unseen. That's kind of you to say, sir, but people see what they want to see. Most don't look past the uniform. Perhaps they should start, Alexander replied, his voice lowering slightly. In that moment, as the morning light cut sharp lines across the glass office, something shifted inside him. This was not an ordinary employee. This was not an ordinary conversation. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this was the beginning of something far bigger than either of them yet realized. The next morning, Alexander asked his assistant to arrange another meeting. No formal agenda, no paperwork, just an invitation for Maye Musk to join him once again. She arrived exactly on time, calm as always, her uniform immaculate, her expression composed. Alexander gestured for her to sit, this time offering coffee, which she politely declined. He studied her for a moment before speaking, weighing his words carefully. "Maye, if you're comfortable, I'd like to know more about your story. You've already told me parts of it, but I sense there's much more beneath the surface." She looked at him, her eyes steady but warm. "I don't mind sharing, sir. Not many people ask." He leaned forward slightly, signaling his attention. "I married very young," she began. "My husband was brilliant, but the marriage was difficult. After the divorce, I found myself in my early 30s with 3 small children and no safety net. We were in South Africa then. The economy was unstable, and being a single mother carried its own challenges." Her voice remained even, but Alexander could sense the weight behind every word. "I was determined my children would not feel the instability I carried inside. I worked wherever I could. Tutored, consulted, even modeled part-time when the opportunity arose. Modeling provided flexible hours, and the extra income helped keep us afloat for a while." She paused, glancing briefly at her hands folded in her lap, before continuing. "Eventually, we moved to Canada. A fresh start. I believed it would be easier there, but starting over in a new country with limited support wasn't simple. My credentials didn't transfer easily. Universities were hesitant to hire someone with no North American teaching experience, no local network. You tried to continue your academic career? I did. I wanted to teach nutrition. I had the degrees, the research, the passion for it. But life doesn't always follow passion. Survival takes priority. The kids needed food, shelter, consistency. So I pivoted. I found work where I could. Grocery stores, health clinics, small nutrition workshops when I was lucky. And all this while raising 3 children? She nodded softly. My eldest was very curious, always tinkering with computers and asking impossible questions. The middle one had an eye for business from a young age, always thinking about food, recipes, restaurants. And my youngest, she was drawn to storytelling, the arts, even as a child. They were bright. Brilliant, actually. I refused to let them feel limited because of our circumstances. Alexander sat quietly, absorbing every detail, every subtle shift in her voice. "There were nights I wasn't sure how we would make it," she continued, her voice still calm, but with a faint edge now. "Times when rent was due, and groceries were thin. Once, I stood in a pawn shop with a small piece of jewelry that belonged to my mother, debating whether to sell it just to buy enough groceries for the week." "Did you sell it?" "No." She smiled faintly. "I couldn't. It was one of the last things I had from her. Somehow, we managed. A small freelance contract came through that week, just enough to scrape by." Alexander felt his chest tighten. The quiet dignity in her voice made her story even heavier. "How did you manage your own studies during all of that?" he asked gently. "At night, after the children were asleep, I would read textbooks on the couch, listen to language tapes while folding laundry, borrow audiobooks from the library and practice pronunciation while cooking. Every spare moment became a lesson. It was my way of keeping part of myself alive." "You taught yourself 9 languages this way?" "Yes. Language was something I could control. It didn't require a boss or a contract or anyone else's permission. Just time, repetition, and discipline." She smiled softly, almost to herself. "And perhaps a bit of stubbornness." Alexander leaned back in his chair, struggling to fully grasp the enormity of what she had just described. Most people would have crumbled under the weight of it. Many did. But she had found a way not only to endure, but to grow. Quietly. Invisibly. "And your children?" She brightened slightly, as though a warm current passed through her. "They're all doing well now. My eldest built companies in the tech world. My son in the middle runs a chain of successful restaurants. My daughter is a producer and filmmaker. They've each carved their own paths, And I couldn't be prouder. Alexander stared at her, realizing fully now who she was referring to, though she never once mentioned their names. The pieces were fitting together in his mind, but still, she offered no boast, no expectation of special treatment. You've built something extraordinary, May. Life happened, she said simply, her tone as steady as ever. I adapted. That's what you do when you have no choice. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening slightly. Most people wouldn't have made it this far, he said quietly. I don't dwell on that. Everyone carries something. Mine just took a different shape. There was a silence that filled the room, not uncomfortable, but heavy with mutual understanding. Alexander exhaled, breaking the moment. May, would you be open to considering an opportunity? She tilted her head slightly, curious but cautious. What kind of opportunity? I'm not entirely sure yet, he admitted. But I believe your skills, your experiences, and frankly, your entire story bring a value this company desperately needs and has been missing. I'd like to explore that, if you're willing. May studied him for a long moment, as though measuring not just his words, but his intent behind them. All right, Mr. Whitaker. I'm listening. He smiled, feeling the first spark of something that had been missing in his leadership for years. Then let's see where this takes us. As she stood to leave, he watched her walk across the office floor, her steps quiet, steady, deliberate. For years she had walked these halls unseen. But not anymore. Not to him. And soon, not to anyone. 2 days later, the call came in earlier than expected. Alexander's assistant appeared at his office door, a hint of urgency in her voice. The delegation from Sao Paulo just arrived. They moved the meeting up. And the translator. She cancelled last minute. Her flight was delayed out of Miami. We don't have anyone. Alexander didn't hesitate. Bring May to conference room 4C. Within minutes, May arrived, calm but curious, wiping her hands discreetly on her uniform as she entered the executive wing. She saw the tension on his face and read the room instantly. Mr. Whitaker. He stepped forward, lowering his voice just enough to signal discretion but not alarm. I need your help. The Brazilian partners are here early, and our translator isn't. I know this is sudden, but I remember you mentioning Portuguese. Yes, sir, she replied, her voice even. I can do that. Her calmness struck him again, not rehearsed but deeply ingrained. They walked together to conference room 4C, where 4 Brazilian executives sat flipping through briefing packets, checking phones, and exchanging polite small talk in Portuguese. As they entered, the room shifted slightly, eyes landing on May with mild surprise. Bom dia, senors, May said, her tone warm and fluid. Welcome. Please allow me to assist with translation today. The men visibly relaxed. Shoulders eased, polite nods turned into genuine smiles. They responded quickly, and within seconds, the room was alive with conversation that no longer needed barriers. Alexander watched from the side, listening to the words he couldn't understand but fully grasping the transformation happening in front of him. May didn't simply translate. She connected. She matched tone, adjusted inflection, bridged cultural nuances that software or even trained linguists often missed. The conversation moved smoothly until one of the Brazilian executives, eager to address a sensitive point, introduced a term tied to recent changes in Brazil's freight regulations. His phrasing was sharp, almost aggressive. May paused for a fraction of a second, reading the room, reading Whitaker's tense posture. The term, if interpreted literally, could suggest non-compliance on Whitaker Global's part, something that might trigger a contractual dispute or worse. She pivoted, her voice measured and diplomatic. What he means to clarify, she said in Portuguese, is the importance of mutual alignment with the latest maritime guidelines to avoid potential discrepancies during cross-border shipping. She softened the language without losing accuracy, preserving respect while neutralizing potential conflict. The Brazilian executive caught the adjustment and smiled appreciatively. He nodded, replying with a softened tone, acknowledging the point without escalating. Whitaker's shoulders eased as the conversation glided forward. Agreements were reached, minor issues smoothed, misunderstandings avoided before they had the chance to grow claws. When the meeting wrapped 40 minutes later, one of the Brazilian partners approached Alexander privately. "She's remarkable," he said in clear but accented English. "Better than most professional translators we've worked with this year." "Where did you find her?" Alexander glanced at Maye, who was quietly collecting empty coffee cups onto a tray. "Right here," he replied. Walking back down the hallway afterward, Alexander couldn't hide the quiet awe in his voice. "Maye, that was exceptional." She smiled faintly. "I've spent enough time navigating systems to recognize when words might trip people." "You didn't just translate," he said. "You mediated. Language is never just words, Mr. Whitaker. It's trust. You build it, or you lose it." He stopped, looking at her fully now. "You've done more in one meeting than some departments manage in months." She shook her head gently. "I only did what was needed." "That may be, but you did it in a way very few can." For the first time, Alexander saw it fully. Maye Musk wasn't simply someone with linguistic skill. She was a problem solver at the highest level, someone who could read nuance, navigate tension, and find the invisible threads that held negotiations together. And as they stepped into the elevator, Alexander knew with absolute certainty, this was just the beginning. The announcement came on a Monday morning. A company-wide email sent directly from Alexander Whitaker's office. Subject line: New leadership appointment. It was brief, professional, and yet within moments, the entire building felt different. Whitaker Global Logistics is pleased to announce the appointment of Maye Musk as Cultural Liaison, International Affairs, effective immediately. Maye brings a wealth of global expertise, linguistic fluency, and cross-cultural insight that will strengthen our international partnerships and internal operations. By noon, the whispers had spread through every floor, every department, every Slack channel. Some employees read the email twice, even 3 times, wondering if they had misunderstood. Maye Musk, the janitor, the woman who had been polishing floors and wiping conference tables just last week. Now an executive. The reactions were swift, but far from uniform. In the break room on the 9th floor, Laura, the head of HR, leaned in over her coffee cup, lowering her voice as if the glass walls themselves might be listening. "It's political," she said sharply. "Alexander's trying to make a statement. Diversity. Inclusion. Look at us. Look how progressive we are." Her audience, a small circle of mid-level managers, nodded with thin smiles, eager to align themselves with her sentiment without being the first to speak too forcefully. "But she's qualified, isn't she?" One of them ventured cautiously. "She speaks 9 languages." Laura exhaled through her nose, annoyed. "Speaking languages doesn't make you an executive. She's never run a department. She's never managed a team. She doesn't understand corporate systems. This is reckless." Meanwhile, on the executive floor, Mark, director of sales, wasn't bothering to keep his voice down. "Why her?" he snapped during a leadership meeting. "I've been here 3 years waiting for an opportunity like this. We have managers with MBAs, years of experience, and suddenly he pulls someone off the janitorial staff and hands her a C-suite title? What message does that send?" The room was tense. A few executives nodded silently. Others avoided eye contact altogether. No one wanted to challenge Alexander directly, but the discomfort was spreading. Alexander listened calmly, his fingers steepled in front of him. When Mark finally paused, Whitaker spoke. "It sends the message that we recognize talent where it exists. Period." Mark scoffed under his breath. "Or that we're improvising." Alexander didn't flinch. "We've spent years recruiting outside experts, paying consulting firms to fix problems they don't understand. Meanwhile, someone right under our nose was solving problems before they ever reached my desk." Mark opened his mouth, but Alexander's voice sharpened just enough to end the debate. "This is my decision. And it stands." The leadership meeting ended quickly after that, but the murmurs did not. By the end of the day, theories were flying across the company's unofficial message boards. On private group chats and whispered phone calls, the speculation grew bolder. Some said Maye must have secret government experience, possibly intelligence work from her native South Africa or Canada. Others suggested she was some kind of fixer brought in quietly to manage foreign negotiations off the books. A few even floated that she might have personal ties to Alexander himself, though no one dared say that part aloud in the open. In the staff lounge, a junior analyst named Eric scrolled through one of the company's internal chat threads, shaking his head. "I mean, it's wild," he whispered to his colleague. "One day she's mopping floors, the next she's in charge of international affairs?" The colleague shrugged. "You heard what they say. 9 languages. Handled that Brazil deal like it was nothing." "Still," Eric muttered, "it's weird." By Wednesday, the tension had crystallized into 2 camps. The skeptics, who saw her promotion as an unearned leap driven by Alexander's personal agenda, and the quiet supporters, who admired her but feared speaking up too loudly. On the operations floor, Samantha from procurement was one of the few who voiced her opinion openly. "Honestly, I think it's inspiring," she told a small group gathered near the elevators. She earned that shot. "People act like credentials are everything, but half the managers here couldn't navigate a cultural negotiation if their life depended on it." Her co-workers glanced around nervously, worried who might overhear. "Be careful, Sam," one of them warned. "You know how people talk." Samantha crossed her arms, undeterred. Let them talk. But talk they did. The rumors spilled beyond the building, finding their way onto industry forums and LinkedIn gossip threads. Whitaker Global had always been known for its tight control over public image, but this was different. This was human intrigue, and no amount of PR spin could contain it. "Who is Maye Musk?" One speculative post read, "Former intelligence operative? Secret global negotiator? Government advisor?" Her background is suspiciously light for someone now sitting on top of international operations. Another post, more cynical, suggested, or maybe just the CEO's personal project to check a diversity box. A janitor to executive story makes for great headlines. Alexander read these posts late at night, sitting alone in his office. He felt the familiar pang of frustration mixed with guilt. The very thing he admired in Maye, her strength, her resilience, her depth, was now being twisted into ammunition for those who had never once looked beyond her uniform. He glanced at his reflection in the darkened window, his own face harder than usual. This was the price of change. He had known it wouldn't be smooth. But knowing and living it were different things. Maye, meanwhile, moved through the days as she always had. Steady. Focused. She reported to her new office on the 12th floor, a modest but bright corner space freshly prepared for her. The nameplate on her door gleamed under the hallway lights. Maye Musk, Cultural Liaison, International Affairs. As she settled into the new routine, she remained largely quiet about the noise swirling around her. People watched her more now. Some nodded politely in the halls. Others averted their eyes. A few offered thin smiles that carried layers of skepticism beneath them. One afternoon, Laura passed by Maye's office under the pretense of dropping off paperwork. She glanced briefly at the space, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Settling in, I see," Laura said, her tone cool. Maye met her gaze with quiet calm. "Yes. It's been an adjustment." Laura hesitated, searching for a more pointed comment, but Maye's composed demeanor offered no easy opening. Eventually, Laura forced a polite smile and left without further comment. Inside, Maye exhaled slowly. She understood exactly what was happening. She had lived through more intimidating storms than corporate politics. But still, she felt the pressure tightening around her, a growing current beneath the surface. At home that evening, Maye prepared tea and sat quietly by her small kitchen window. The city lights shimmered outside, indifferent to the tension unfolding inside office towers. She glanced at her phone, a message from her daughter waiting. "How's the first week going, Mom?" Maye typed back a simple reply. "It's interesting." She paused, staring at the blinking cursor for a moment before adding another line. "But I'm holding steady." Her daughter's reply came quickly. "Of course you are. You always do." Maye smiled softly, closing her eyes for a moment. The noise would continue. The whispers would rise and fall. But she had built her life on storms like this. And she was not about to bend now. The summons came on a Thursday morning, simple and direct. Eleanor Sinclair wanted to see her. No time was suggested, no agenda provided, just a quiet message through an assistant that made its weight known. Maye read it twice, her stomach tightening as she did. She had known this moment would come eventually. Now, it had arrived. She walked back to her office, shutting the door softly behind her. The walls felt a little smaller today, the ceiling lower. For all her calm, her steady hands and even voice, the tension was real. Eleanor Sinclair was not simply a board member. She was one of the oldest forces in the company, sharp, calculating, protective of the institution's traditions. This was not going to be a casual conversation. Maye sat down and reached for her phone. She stared at the screen for a few seconds before dialing her daughter. "Hey Mom," Tosca answered cheerfully. "Everything okay?" Maye hesitated for a breath, her voice lower than usual. "I just needed to hear your voice for a moment." "What's going on?" her daughter asked gently, sensing something beneath the surface. "I have a meeting. A difficult one." "You're going to be fine, Mom. You always are. Just be yourself." Maye smiled softly, grateful for the steadiness in her daughter's tone. "That's what I plan to do." They spoke for another minute, nothing deep, just enough to let the quiet courage settle back into her bones. After she hung up, Maye stood and looked briefly at her reflection in the glass window. She adjusted her jacket, smoothed her hair, and exhaled slowly. The nerves were still there, but so was the resolve. When she entered the boardroom on the 17th floor, Eleanor Sinclair was already seated at the long mahogany table. The room was colder than the rest of the building, as if intentionally designed to keep emotions in check. Papers were stacked neatly in front of Eleanor, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, her fingers laced together with surgical precision. "Please, have a seat," Eleanor said without looking up. Maye took the chair opposite her, folding her hands in her lap, keeping her back straight. "I've reviewed your file extensively," Eleanor began, finally meeting Maye's eyes. "You have no MBA. No previous corporate management experience. No leadership training certifications. No formal business education beyond your original nutrition degrees. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Maye answered calmly. Eleanor paused, studying her like a specimen under glass. 3 weeks ago, you were mopping floors in this very building. And now you sit here, tasked with guiding international affairs for a multi-billion-dollar operation. "Yes," Maye said simply. "Help me understand something, Miss Musk. How does someone with your background qualify for this role?" Maye took a breath. "Because I speak 9 languages fluently. Because I understand not just the words, but the cultures behind them. Because I've already prevented 2 vendor disputes and resolved a 3-month delay with our Brazil partners. Because I've navigated more cross-border conversations in the past 2 weeks than some have in years. And because I've lived my entire adult life managing complex negotiations that no classroom could have prepared me for." Eleanor's lips pressed tighter. "You think instinct replaces experience? I think results matter more than theory." The board member sat back slightly, narrowing her eyes. "You're a gamble, Miss Musk. A dangerous gamble." Maye didn't blink. "I've been a gamble my entire life, Mrs. Sinclair. And I'm still here." The words hung in the air like a stone dropped in still water. The silence that followed was thick, but not uncertain. Eleanor's gaze faltered for the first time, the precise edges of her authority dulled just slightly. "You realize," Eleanor said, her voice losing a fraction of its sharpness, "that many people in this company will question you." "They already are." "I expect that," Maye answered evenly. "I've never asked to be protected from scrutiny. I only ask for the same standard anyone else would face. Let my work speak." Eleanor glanced down at her papers again, as though searching for some final argument but finding none that wouldn't sound petty now. After a long pause, she closed the folder with a soft thud. "Very well." Maye stood slowly, her movements controlled. "Thank you for your time." Eleanor gave a polite nod, but her eyes revealed a storm of thoughts still circling, unsettled. Maye exited the boardroom without rushing, walking back to the elevator with steady, deliberate steps. As the doors closed behind her, she allowed herself a single quiet exhale. The battle was not over. But for today, she had stood her ground. Months passed, but the whispers grew quiet. In their place came something far more powerful. Change. It started small, almost invisible, as Maye began quietly mentoring a handful of employees from departments few executives ever visited. Warehouse clerks, front desk receptionists, overnight security guards. People no one had ever asked about their backgrounds, their skills, their dreams. Maye asked. From those conversations, the Hidden Talents Initiative was born. A simple idea at first. Internal workshops, language training, cultural fluency programs, leadership mentoring. But within a year, it took on a life of its own. Employees who had once been overlooked were being promoted, their skills finally recognized. One young woman from the shipping department now led negotiations with their Southeast Asia vendors. A former night shift IT technician was promoted to lead the company's emerging cybersecurity division. The talent had always been there. It only needed to be seen. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, as Maye returned to her office, she found an envelope resting on her desk. There was no name, no return address, just her name written neatly in block letters. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single note. I used to believe I would never be noticed. But today, I believe I might be. Because you showed me that people like us can be seen. Thank you. There was no signature. No one needed to claim it. The words were enough. Maye sat for a moment, the note resting gently between her fingers. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The message was clear, and it was more than enough. Later that week, Alexander invited her to join him for a small ceremony. Quiet. No speeches. No press. Just a simple plaque being mounted outside the newly renovated internal training center. The Maye Musk room. As she stood before it, she traced the engraved letters with her fingertips. Not to admire them, but to remember the journey that had brought her here. The long nights. The overlooked years. The quiet perseverance. And as new employees began filing into the room behind her, eager to learn, to be seen, Maye smiled softly. The circle was complete.